The neighbors laughed at the house on wheels. Last spring, the water took their son, and their ordinary house became a trap. His wife suggested a solution that no one believed in until the river flooded again. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The land did not look hostile at first glance. That was the deception it offered to those who came too late or trusted it too much. Wide, pale plains stretched outward until they blurred into low hills, broken only by scattered trees bent permanently in one direction, as if the wind had shaped them over generations. A river cut through the land not far from the homestead, broad and slow for most of the year, its surface reflecting the sky with a calm that suggested patience rather than threat. In summer, it fed crops and livestock. In autumn, it softened the soil for planting. But those who had lived here long enough knew that the river remembered other shapes, other paths, and that it would one day try to reclaim them. The couple had settled on this land years earlier, when youth still made hardship feel temporary and pain something that could be worked through with effort. There were other families scattered miles away, close enough to help in true emergencies, far enough that most days passed in isolation. This was frontier life as it truly existed, not the version told in cities or sung in traveling songs. It was not heroic. It was repetitive, exhausting, and entirely indifferent to intention. Their house stood slightly above the surrounding plain, or so they had believed. Built of rough-hewn logs hauled and shaped by hand, it had taken years to complete. Every beam carried memory. Every joint reflected a decision made under pressure. To reinforce one wall instead of another, to angle the roof lower against the wind, to place the stove where heat would reach the sleeping area first. The house was not beautiful, but it was solid, and solidity mattered more than beauty ever could. Inside, the ceilings were low to preserve warmth. The windows were small and placed carefully to catch light without surrendering heat. The stove sat at the heart of the house, its iron darkened by years of use. The walls bore the marks of daily life, scratches from furniture moved too often, discoloration from smoke, faint carvings made by a child's hand that had once been too curious to be still. They had built this place together, the man and the woman, learning through mistakes and near failures. He was strong, shaped by labor and long days outdoors, his body carrying the quiet fatigue of someone who no longer counted hours. She was smaller, but no less hardened by the work, her strength showing in endurance rather than force. They spoke little, not because they lacked words, but because words were often unnecessary between them. Each knew what the other needed without explanation. Their son was the center around which everything quietly turned. He had been born into this world of cold and wind and had never known another. He understood early how to move carefully on frozen ground, how to listen to the river's sound, how to stay near the house when storms gathered without warning. He filled the narrow space with movement and noise, his presence turning the house from shelter into home. His boots were always by the door, his coat hung too low on its peg, his laughter carrying even through the thickest walls. The winter before everything changed had been the harshest they could remember. It arrived early, with a suddenness that left no time for doubt. Snow fell heavy and relentless, covering the land until familiar shapes disappeared entirely. The wind howled without pause, forcing itself into every weakness it could find. Nights stretched long and silent except for the sound of the storm pressing against the walls. They rationed fuel carefully. Wood was stacked high against the side of the house, and even then, there were nights when the fire burned low and the cold crept inward, settling into bones and breath. The house responded as it always had, groaning under the pressure, but holding firm. Frost formed along the inside edges of the windows, delicate patterns that caught the morning light. The walls cracked faintly in the deepest cold, but never failed. There were moments during that winter when the man lay awake listening to the wind and wondering whether this would be the night the roof finally gave way, whether the weight of snow would prove too much even for the beams he trusted. The woman lay beside him, equally awake, counting the sounds she recognized and the ones she did not. Between them, the child slept, wrapped in layers, breathing steadily, unaware of how closely safety and disaster lived beside one another. When spring finally came, it arrived quietly, as if apologizing for the severity that had preceded it. The snow softened, then retreated. Water ran in thin streams across the land, carving shallow paths where none had existed before. The air smelled of damp earth and renewal. After months of confinement, the world seemed open again. The man spoke of repairs, of improvements they could make now that winter had been survived. The house had proven itself. It had endured where others had failed. That endurance bred confidence, the most dangerous comfort the frontier ever offered. The woman noticed things he did not. The ground near the foundation felt softer beneath her feet. Small pools lingered longer than they should have. The river sounded different at night, deeper, more insistent. But winter fatigue dulled caution. They had earned a season of relief, or so they believed. On the morning the man left to gather supplies and tools from a distant settlement, there was no sense of foreboding. He packed what he needed, kissed his wife's cheek, ruffled his son's hair, and promised to return before dark. The river lay calm. The sky was pale and open. The day unfolded as countless others had. The woman worked near the house, mending, cleaning, preparing for planting. The boy played within sight, drawn repeatedly to the edges of the yard where water collected, fascinated by its movement. By midday, the ground had grown heavy beneath their feet. The change came without warning. The woman heard it before she saw it, a low rushing sound that did not belong to the ordinary flow of spring runoff. When she turned toward the river, she saw water advancing not in gentle streams, but in a broad, forceful surge. The river had stepped beyond itself. She called for her son, her voice sharp with a fear she did not yet understand. He turned toward her, but the ground between them was already shifting, water cutting channels too quickly to cross. Within minutes, the lower edge of the house was surrounded. The structure did not collapse. That was the cruelest part. It stood firm as water pressed against its walls, rising steadily, finding its way inside through every small opening. The woman fought against the current, clawing her way back toward the door, shouting until her voice broke. She reached a window, forced it open, dragged herself through. But the boy was no longer within reach. When the water finally receded hours later, it left the house standing exactly as it had before, only soaked, silent, and emptied of its future. The man returned at dusk to find the structure intact and his world irreparably altered. The house had survived the winter. It had survived the flood. But it had failed at the one thing that mattered. The house remained where it had always been, standing firm against the land as if nothing irreversible had happened. Its walls dried slowly under the spring sun, the dark stains left by the water fading unevenly, like bruises that refused to heal at the same pace. From the outside, it still looked like a victory. Anyone passing by would have seen a structure that had endured winter, flood, and time itself. But endurance, they would soon learn, was not the same as safety, and survival of wood meant nothing when life had already been taken. In the days that followed the flood, time lost its familiar rhythm. Morning and evening blurred together, marked only by light shifting across the plain and the slow return of birds to the trees. Inside the house, the silence was heavier than the cold had ever been. Every sound echoed too clearly. The creak of the floorboards, the hiss of the stove, even the movement of air through the narrow windows felt intrusive, as though the house itself resisted being occupied again. The man moved through the space with a rigid determination, cleaning what could be cleaned, repairing what the water had damaged. He worked until his hands were raw, his muscles aching, as if labor could somehow restore balance. He avoided certain corners of the room, certain marks on the wall that no amount of scrubbing could erase. When exhaustion finally forced him to stop, he sat staring at the fire, his eyes fixed on nothing, his thoughts circling the same moment again and again. The decision to leave that morning, the promise to return before dark. The woman did not interfere with his work, but she did not join him either. She moved more slowly now, her attention pulled outward rather than inward. She spent long hours outside the house, walking the perimeter of the land, studying the ground as if it were a map written in a language she was only beginning to understand. Where others might have seen mud and waterlogged soil, she saw patterns forming. Channels carved by runoff, depressions where water gathered and lingered. The land was showing her what it had always been capable of, now that she was finally forced to look. At night, they lay side by side without touching. Sleep came rarely and never deeply. When it did, it brought memories rather than rest. The house seemed to close in on them after dark, each wall holding a reminder of what had been lost. The bed felt too large without the small shape that had once slept nearby. The absence had weight, pressing down on them until breathing felt like effort. There were no arguments between them, no accusations spoken aloud. The blame existed nonetheless, hanging unspoken in the air. The man carried his guilt like an invisible wound, reopening it with every memory of the morning he had left. The woman's grief took a different shape. It was quieter, sharper, directed less at the past and more at the certainty that what had happened was not an accident, but a consequence. As spring advanced, the river settled back into its familiar course, as if satisfied with what it had taken. Neighbors came occasionally, offering help in ways they understood. Repairs, food, silence shared without questions. They spoke of the flood as a rare event, an unfortunate convergence of weather and timing. The man nodded and accepted their words, needing to believe that it had been unavoidable. The woman listened, but did not agree. She began to remember stories she had once dismissed, tales of old homesteads abandoned after repeated flooding, of families who learned too late that land remembered every path water had ever taken. She traced those memories against what she saw now, the softened soil beneath the house, the subtle slope she had once considered insignificant. The house had not been built on high ground. It had been built on borrowed time. The realization did not come all at once. It grew slowly, solidifying with each day spent observing the land. The problem had never been that the house was weak. It was that it was fixed, rooted, unable to respond when the land changed its mind. One evening, as the sun dropped low and cast long shadows across the plain, the woman stood near the river and watched the water move. It flowed without resistance, shaping itself to whatever space it occupied. It did not cling. It did not insist. It moved because movement was survival. That was when the idea began to take shape, not as a solution, but as a question she could no longer ignore. Why had they believed that safety meant staying in one place? Why had they trusted walls to protect them from something that could simply go around or beneath those walls? The frontier had never promised permanence. It rewarded those who adapted, not those who endured blindly. When she first spoke of her thoughts to her husband, she did so carefully, as though testing the strength of her own words. She spoke of the land, of the water, of patterns she could no longer unsee. She did not mention the child at first, knowing how quickly grief could close him off. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence between them. Then he shook his head, not in anger, but in disbelief. He told her that every family here had faced hardship, that rebuilding stronger was the only way forward. To leave the house, to abandon what they had built, felt to him like admitting failure, not just of construction, but of purpose. She waited before responding. When she did, her voice was steady. She told him the house had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had stood firm. And that was precisely the problem. It had not protected their son. It had trapped him. The words landed heavily, not as accusation, but as fact. The man looked away, his jaw tightening. He did not argue. He could not. The truth of it pressed too close to the wound he carried. She went on, explaining that she was not speaking of leaving the land entirely. She was speaking of refusing to let the land decide everything, of building something that could respond, that could move when the river rose and shelter them from the wind when winter returned. She spoke of old wagons, of the way early travelers had survived by never allowing themselves to become immobile. The idea sounded wrong to him, almost offensive. A house was meant to stand. A home was meant to be rooted. What she was describing felt like running, like living in fear rather than facing it. She listened to his objections without interrupting, just as he had listened to her. When he finished, she told him quietly that fear had already found them. Staying where they were would not banish it. It would only wait for the next spring. That night, neither of them slept. The house seemed to listen as well, its familiar sound suddenly foreign. By morning, the decision had not been made, but something had shifted. The man walked the land with her, seeing now what she pointed out. The subtle slope, the traces of past floods he had never noticed. The realization that what had happened wasn't an anomaly, but a warning. His agreement, when it came, wasn't confident. It was heavy, reluctant, and shaped by the understanding that staying meant living inside a memory neither of them could survive much longer. He told her he would try, not because he believed the idea was right, but because he could no longer bear the certainty that remaining meant repeating the same mistake. They did not dismantle the house. They could not. It stood as proof of effort, of love, of loss. They gathered what they needed and left it behind, intact and empty, a monument to a version of safety they could no longer afford. As they walked away, the woman did not look back. The man did, once, long enough to see the house framed against the land, unchanged and unmoved. He understood then that survival on the frontier was not about building something that could withstand everything. It was about knowing when to let go of what could not change. The ground beneath them felt different as they moved forward, less like a trap and more like a path. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since the flood, uncertainty felt preferable to waiting. They did not go far at first. Leaving the old house behind did not mean abandoning the land entirely, only stepping away from the place where memory had hardened into something unlivable. They camped on slightly higher ground, where the wind swept more freely and the soil felt firmer underfoot. From there, the old homestead was still visible in the distance, its familiar outline unchanged, as if it were waiting for them to return and admit their mistake. They did not. The idea that had begun as a question now demanded form. It no longer lived only in the woman's observations or the man's reluctant agreement. It had become a necessity. If they were to remain on this land at all, they needed shelter that could respond rather than resist, something that would not challenge the river or defy the wind, but move with them when the land shifted its balance. The search for a foundation began with what they could afford, which was little. New materials were out of the question. What they needed already existed somewhere, forgotten or dismissed. It was the man who found it first, half sunk in weeds near a trail that had once been more traveled. An old, horse-drawn wagon, its boards weathered and its iron fittings rusted, stood abandoned where someone had decided it was no longer worth repairing. One wheel leaned at an angle, its rim cracked, the axle worn thin from years of use. To most eyes, it was scrap. To the woman, it was possibility. They circled it in silence, examining the frame, testing the wood with careful pressure. The structure was sound beneath the decay. The iron braces, though rusted, still held. The axle could be reinforced. The wagon had been built to carry weight, to endure long journeys over uneven ground. It had already survived movement, weather, and time. It did not resist change. It had been shaped by it. They brought it back piece by piece, repairing what could be repaired, replacing what could not. The work was slow and deliberate. Each decision mattered more than it ever had with the house, because space was now limited. Every inch had to serve a purpose. There would be no wasted corners, no unused walls. The woman planned carefully, imagining how heat would move, where they would sleep, how they would store food and tools without clutter turning into danger. The man approached the task with skepticism that softened into focus. He had built before, but never under constraints like these. Here, strength alone was not enough. Balance mattered. Weight distribution mattered. A mistake would not simply weaken a wall. It could make movement impossible. They reinforced the wagon's frame first, bracing it with additional beams, securing joints with iron straps salvaged from old equipment. The walls rose slowly, layered rather than thick, with space left deliberately between boards. That space they filled with dried grass, wool, anything that could trap warmth without adding too much weight. The woman insisted on it, remembering how cold had crept through the old house despite its mass. The stove was the greatest challenge. Fire had to be controlled without suffocating the space or filling it with smoke. They built a small, efficient hearth, anchored low, its flue carefully angled so heat would travel before escaping. The man tested it repeatedly, adjusting the draw, sealing gaps, watching how warmth moved along the floor and up the walls. When they finally sat inside with the fire burning steadily, the difference was immediate. The heat did not vanish upward. It lingered. Furniture was built into the structure itself. A bed that folded and locked into place, storage compartments beneath benches, hooks set into beams for tools and clothing. Nothing was loose. Nothing could shift unexpectedly when the wagon moved. The ceiling curved slightly, just enough to prevent snow from accumulating heavily when winter came. The roof was sealed carefully, layered to repel water without becoming rigid. Throughout the process, neighbors began to notice. At first, they watched from a distance, curiosity outweighing judgment. As the shape of the structure became clear, curiosity gave way to amusement. People stopped by uninvited, offering opinions they had not been asked for. They laughed openly, shaking their heads at the sight of a house being built where a wagon should have been. They called it foolish. They called it fear disguised as invention. Some said it was an insult to the land, others that it was an insult to common sense. A house, they insisted, was meant to stand. Anything else was a sign of weakness. The man felt their words more sharply than he admitted. There were moments when doubt crept in, when he looked at the narrow space and wondered whether they were building another mistake, only this time one that would fail more quickly. The woman heard the laughter too, but it did not reach her in the same way. She had stopped measuring decisions by approval long ago. They tested the structure repeatedly before trusting it. Cold nights revealed drafts they had missed. The stove smoked until the flue was adjusted again. One wheel failed under strain and had to be rebuilt stronger than before. Each failure was a lesson rather than a verdict. Unlike the old house, this one allowed correction without catastrophe. The first time they moved it fully assembled, the man's hands shook on the reins. The wagon groaned, protested, then rolled forward. The structure held. Inside, nothing shifted. The woman walked beside it, watching the ground, guiding the movement toward firmer soil. When they stopped, neither spoke for a long moment. The house had moved, and with it, something heavy loosened inside them. They spent their first night inside with mixed emotions. The space was tight, unfamiliar. Every sound was magnified. But the warmth was steady. The air remained dry. The wind passed around them rather than through them. Sleep came slowly, but it came. As autumn approached, the laughter grew louder. People pointed out that winter would prove the folly of their design. A wagon was not a house, they said. It would never hold against true cold. The man listened without responding. He was no longer trying to convince anyone. The woman continued refining small details, sealing gaps, improving insulation, preparing for what she knew would come. When the first snow fell, it settled briefly on the curved roof, then slid away. Inside, the stove burned low and steady. They watched the flakes through a narrow window, aware that this was the true beginning of the test. The house that had survived the winter before had done so through resistance. This one would have to survive through understanding. As the cold deepened, the wagon house did not boast its success. It simply functioned. The temperature inside remained manageable. The structure flexed slightly with the wind, but did not fight it. They learned its sounds, its responses, just as they had learned the old houses, but with less fear attached. By the time winter fully claimed the land, the laughter had quieted, replaced by watchful silence. People noticed that the strange house still stood, still moved when repositioned, still held warmth when others struggled. No one admitted curiosity aloud, but it lingered all the same. The woman stood one evening watching the sky darken early, the land settling into its long season of cold. The house behind her was not impressive, it was not permanent, but it was alive in a way the old one had never been. It could listen. It could respond. She knew winter was only part of the trial. Spring would come again. The river would rise. And this time, they would not wait. Winter arrived without ceremony, as it always did on the frontier. There was no single storm that announced it, no dramatic shift that allowed for preparation beyond what had already been done. The cold simply settled in and refused to lift. Days shortened, the sun losing its strength long before it touched the horizon, and the land grew rigid beneath a skin of frost that thickened with each passing night. The wind returned to its old habits, pressing across the plains with steady insistence, testing everything that stood against it. The wagon house faced the season quietly. It did not dominate the land, nor did it challenge it. Set against a natural rise and turned deliberately to narrow its profile against the prevailing wind, it appeared smaller than the fixed houses scattered across the plain. That smallness was deceptive. Inside, warmth gathered and remained. The stove burned low and efficiently, the heat traveling where it was meant to go rather than vanishing upward. The walls held without sweating, the insulation doing its work without complaint. They learned to live within the tighter boundaries of the space as winter deepened. Movement became deliberate. Every object had its place, every action carried intention. There was no room for excess, and that absence of clutter brought an unexpected calm. The man found that he slept more soundly than he had in years. The woman woke often before dawn, listening to the structure respond to the wind, understanding its language in a way she never had with the old house. Outside, the frontier struggled. Snow piled against fixed walls, forcing people to dig paths just to reach their doors. Roofs sagged beneath weight they were never meant to carry. The river froze unevenly, its surface deceptive, groaning softly beneath the ice. Livestock was lost, not in dramatic numbers, but steadily, quietly, the way the frontier always claimed its toll. From time to time, neighbors passed by, their visits shorter than before, their laughter absent. They did not ask questions directly. They did not need to. The evidence stood plainly in the smoke rising steadily from the wagon house's flue, in the absence of frantic repairs, in the simple fact that its occupants remained alive and functional, while others merely endured. Winter stretched on, harder than the one that had come before. The man remembered that earlier season clearly, the way the old house had resisted with brute force, the constant anxiety that one failure would unravel everything. This winter felt different. The fear was present, but it was quieter, more contained. The house was not invincible, but it was adaptable, and that distinction mattered more than any measure of strength. When the first subtle signs of spring appeared, they were easy to miss. A slight change in the quality of light, the faint softening of the ground near midday before it froze again at night. The woman noticed these shifts immediately. She had trained herself to read them, not as promises of relief, but as warnings of what would follow. She walked the land each day, her path circling outward, her attention fixed on the river and the low places nearby. She watched where snow melted first, where water gathered, how quickly the soil darkened. The memories of the previous spring did not overwhelm her now. They guided her. She did not wait for confirmation. She had learned the cost of waiting. One evening, as the sky took on the muted colors of thaw, she told her husband that they would move within the week. There was no debate, no hesitation. He nodded, already understanding what she had seen. The decision carried none of the panic that had marked the past. It felt almost routine, as though this had always been part of the plan, even when the plan itself had not yet existed. They prepared methodically. Supplies were secured. The stove was banked and allowed to cool. The wagon was checked and reinforced where winter wear had revealed weaknesses. When the morning came, the ground was still firm enough to travel, though the air carried the unmistakable scent of water waiting to be released. The house moved easily, the wheels turning without protest. The land offered little resistance, as if acknowledging that this time, the people upon it were paying attention. They guided the wagon toward higher ground, a place they had identified months earlier, not out of hope, but out of study. From there, the river could be watched without being challenged. They settled in and waited. The flood came 2 days later. It was less sudden than the one before, but no less powerful. Water rose steadily, spreading outward, reclaiming low ground without urgency. From their vantage point, they watched it reach the old house first, pressing against the familiar walls, seeping inside just as it had before. The structure held, stubborn and unchanged, but that did not matter anymore. It stood empty, its endurance irrelevant. Around them, other homes fared worse. Some shifted, some cracked, some surrendered entirely to the current. People scrambled to salvage what they could, their movements frantic and unplanned. From the rise, the wagon house remained untouched, its occupants observing rather than reacting. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. The woman felt only a quiet confirmation settle within her. The choice had been correct. That knowledge did not erase the loss that had brought them here, but it allowed the loss to exist without continuing to dictate their future. When the water receded, the land was altered again. Channels had deepened. Soil had shifted. The river had rewritten its boundaries. The frontier bore the marks of another season survived, though survival had taken different forms for different people. Neighbors came slowly, one by one, drawn not by curiosity this time, but by something closer to respect. They did not speak much. They looked at the wagon house, then at the ground beneath their feet, then back at the structure that had moved when movement was required. Questions formed but were rarely voiced. Answers were visible without explanation. The man stood with them, listening to the silence between words. He no longer felt the need to defend their choice. It spoke for itself in ways no argument ever could. The woman watched the river as it returned to its narrower course, knowing it would rise again someday, just as it always had. That evening, as the light faded and the land settled into its altered shape, they prepared to move once more, not out of necessity, but out of habit. The house responded as it was meant to, rolling forward with the same quiet reliability it had shown since its creation. For the first time since the loss of their son, the future did not feel like a repetition waiting to happen. It remained uncertain, harsh, and demanding, as the frontier had always been. But uncertainty no longer meant helplessness. They had learned what the land required of those who wished to live upon it. Not defiance, not stubbornness, attention, movement, the willingness to let go of what couldn't change. As the wagon house turned slightly to meet the coming wind, the woman placed her hand against its wall, feeling the steady warmth within. The house did not promise safety forever. Nothing on the frontier ever did. But it offered something better. It knew when to leave. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Watch our other videos for more stories like this, and share this one with someone who might feel it the same way you did.